The lights inside the Long Beach sports arena were hot, the seats were packed, and nobody in that crowd had any idea they were about to watch a piece of martial arts history get written in real time. It was 1964, and the biggest names in American karate had gathered for Ed Parker's International Karate Championships. Judo men, boxers, and hard-nosed karate black belts filled the room, all of them convinced they already knew everything worth knowing about how a fight should look. Then a 23-year-old from Hong Kong stepped onto the mat, and within a matter of seconds, the entire room's understanding of speed, power, and what a fighting style even meant got turned upside down. This is the story of that night, the punch that came out of it, and the karate legend it would go on to humble years later. It is also the story of how one young man's stubborn refusal to follow anyone else's rulebook ended up reshaping combat sports for the next half-century. Long before Bruce Lee became a household name, he was just a restless teenager on the crowded streets of Hong Kong, getting into more fights than his parents could count. He wasn't training for tournaments or trophies. He was surviving neighborhoods where reputation meant everything and backing down meant getting run over. His street fighting habit eventually became so dangerous that his family, worried he might not make it to adulthood, decided the safest move was to send him across the ocean to America, where he had actually been born years earlier during a brief stay by his parents. But before Bruce ever set foot on that boat, he needed someone who could turn his raw aggression into something closer to a discipline. That someone was Yip Man, a soft-spoken teacher who ran a modest Wing Chun school in Hong Kong. At the time, Yip Man was far from famous. He was simply a man rebuilding his own life after fleeing mainland China with almost nothing, teaching a compact, efficient fighting style built around trapping an opponent's limbs and striking in short, direct lines. There was no wasted motion in Wing Chun, no flair for the sake of flair. Every movement had a purpose, and young Bruce absorbed the lessons like he had been waiting his whole life for exactly this kind of structure. Even then, Bruce couldn't just accept a system as gospel. He questioned everything, tested every technique against people who didn't fight the way his classmates did, and started forming an idea that would define the rest of his life. No single style holds every answer. That idea would take years to fully mature, but its roots were planted in that small Hong Kong studio long before anyone in America had heard his name. When Bruce arrived in the United States, there was no red carpet waiting for him. He was a broke immigrant working restaurant jobs just to get by, all while trying to find a way to build a life around the one thing he was truly gifted at. Seattle became his first real home base, and it was there, while attending the University of Washington, that Bruce began teaching a handful of curious students out of makeshift spaces, refining what he had learned from Yip Man and adding pieces of his own. He never confined his classes to people who looked like him. At a time when many traditional Chinese martial arts instructors refused to teach anyone outside their own community, Bruce welcomed all comers. That decision would eventually stir resentment among more conservative teachers in the Chinese martial arts world, some of whom felt he was giving away secrets that were never meant to leave the culture that created them. Bruce didn't care. He believed fighting skill belonged to whoever was willing to put in the work, not to any single bloodline or heritage. By the early 1960s, his growing reputation as a fast, unconventional martial artist had drifted beyond Seattle. He relocated to Oakland and later to the Los Angeles area, opening schools and picking up students from wildly different backgrounds, including boxers and judo competitors who wanted to understand what made his approach so different from anything else on the scene. Word of this intense young instructor with impossible hand speed kept spreading, and it eventually reached the ears of Ed Parker, the man organizing one of the largest karate gatherings in the country. Parker invited Bruce to perform a demonstration at the 1964 Long Beach International Karate Championships, giving him a stage in front of an audience that had never seen anything quite like Jun Fan Gung Fu, the hybrid system Bruce was still shaping at the time. This was not a friendly favor. Karate had spent years building its reputation in America as the toughest, most disciplined striking art around, and plenty of people in that crowd were openly skeptical that some kung fu stylist from Hong Kong had anything worth watching. Bruce didn't try to talk his way past that skepticism. He simply performed. He demonstrated two-finger push-ups that left grown fighters shaking their heads, showed off trapping techniques that neutralized an opponent's strikes before they could even land, and then delivered the moment that would end up defining his entire legend, the one-inch punch. The setup looked deceptively simple. A volunteer stood in front of Bruce, with a fist resting just an inch from his chest, barely any room to generate a swing at all. To anyone watching who had trained in boxing or traditional striking arts, it looked almost harmless, more like a light shove than anything capable of doing real damage. Then Bruce fired the strike, and the volunteer went flying backward into the chairs behind him, gasping to recover his breath while the crowd sat in stunned silence. What made the punch so unsettling wasn't just the distance it traveled. It was how little Bruce's own body seemed to move while throwing it. There was no big wind-up, no dramatic shift of weight that fighters were trained to expect before absorbing a hit. Bruce had spent years studying how to fire his hips, torso, and shoulder in one tightly compressed burst, sending an enormous amount of force through a space most fighters would consider useless for generating any power at all. He borrowed ideas from places nobody expected a martial artist of his era to look, including fencing, a sport he studied obsessively on his own time. He treated his lead hand less like the reserve jab boxers were taught to hold back and more like the tip of a blade, meant to strike first and strike decisively rather than set up something bigger. It broke nearly every convention fighters had been taught, and yet the results were impossible to argue with once you had actually felt it land. Decades later, researchers who studied slow-motion footage of the punch described a rapid chain reaction moving through Bruce's joints, each part of the motion firing almost instantly after the one before it. That kind of sequencing let him generate force disproportionate to how far his fist actually traveled, and it is part of the reason strength coaches and biomechanics researchers still reference the technique today when discussing efficient force transfer in striking. That single demonstration in 1964 didn't just impress the crowd. It caught the attention of television producers who happened to be scouting for a new kind of action star, someone who could move in a way audiences had never seen on American screens. Within a couple of years, Bruce was cast as Kato in The Green Hornet, a role that put his speed and precision in front of millions of households and turned him from a regional martial arts curiosity into a rising public figure. But fame did not soften the skepticism waiting for him back on the tournament floor. If anything, it sharpened it. When Bruce returned to Long Beach in 1967, he wasn't walking into a room of strangers anymore. He was walking into a room full of established champions who had heard the stories and wanted to see for themselves whether the hype matched the reality. Among the fighters watching that night was a man whose name would end up permanently tangled with Bruce's legacy, Vic Moore, a four-time world karate champion and a ferociously respected competitor, with a resume most fighters in the building could only dream of matching. The demonstration between Bruce and Moore that night has become one of the most debated moments in martial arts history, and depending on who you ask, you'll hear two very different accounts of what actually happened. The most widely circulated version says Bruce threw a series of rapid punches toward Moore's face and Moore, despite his championship credentials, could not block a single one. The footage that spread from that night shows Bruce's fists stopping mere inches from Moore's face over and over, each attempt too fast for Moore to react to in time. Moore, however, has spent decades pushing back against that version of events. According to his own retelling, the two men had agreed beforehand that the punches would target the chest rather than the face, a far less risky arrangement for a live demonstration. Moore has maintained that he successfully blocked the opening attempts exactly as planned, only for Bruce to shift targets to the head without warning. Moore claims he then returned strikes of his own, landing blows that never made it into the footage that eventually circulated to the public. It's a claim that has never wavered across decades of interviews, and it's one that a handful of other martial artists who were present that night have echoed in Moore's defense over the years. Others who claim to have watched the exchange up close insist the popular version is accurate and that Moore never landed a strike on Bruce at all. Nearly 60 years later, there is still no footage or testimony that fully settles which account is correct, and the disagreement remains a genuine, unresolved piece of martial arts folklore rather than a simple case of one side lying. What isn't in dispute is what happened to both men afterward. Bruce Lee's demonstration became the seed for a fighting philosophy he would spend the rest of his life refining, built around the idea of intercepting an opponent's attack before it ever fully develops rather than reacting after the fact. That philosophy eventually grew into Jeet Kune Do, the hybrid combat system that would come to define his legacy far beyond any single film role. Vic Moore, for his part, never faded into obscurity either. He went on to win multiple world titles of his own, open respected martial arts schools, and later played a role in bringing kickboxing to national television audiences in the United States, helping introduce the sport to a much wider viewership than it had ever reached before. Despite that resume, Moore has said for years that strangers only ever wanted to talk to him about one thing: the night he stood across from Bruce Lee. It would be easy to write this off as a minor sideshow in a much bigger career, but the truth is that this moment cracked open something much larger in the world of combat sports. Before Bruce Lee, most American fighters were operating inside rigid, single-discipline boxes. Karate stylists trained karate. Judo competitors trained judo. Boxers trained boxing. Cross-pollination between styles was rare, and the idea of borrowing whatever worked best from wherever it came from was treated with suspicion rather than curiosity. Bruce Lee's demonstrations, and the philosophy that grew out of them, chipped away at that mindset piece by piece. He showed audiences and fellow fighters that speed built through obsessive, scientific attention to biomechanics could outclass raw strength, and that borrowing ideas from fencing, boxing, and wrestling wasn't a betrayal of tradition but a path toward becoming a more complete fighter. Those ideas would eventually echo through the development of modern mixed martial arts decades later, long after Bruce Lee's own life ended far too soon. The one-inch punch itself became something of a mythical benchmark, imitated by martial artists for generations, sometimes with impressive results and sometimes with painful consequences for students who tried to replicate it without the years of foundational training Bruce had put in first. It remains one of the most studied and referenced striking techniques in martial arts history, still analyzed in biomechanics research decades after that first stunned crowd watched a grown man get launched backward from what looked like almost no distance at all. Whether you believe Vic Moore's version of that 1967 exchange or the more famous account that spread through magazines and highlight reels, one thing about that era of Bruce Lee's career is undeniable. He walked into rooms full of people who doubted him, delivered something they had never seen before, and left them arguing about what they had just witnessed for the rest of their lives. Few fighters in history can claim that kind of lasting impact from a demonstration that lasted only a few seconds on a stage. That argument, decades later, still hasn't fully gone quiet. And maybe that's the most fitting tribute to Bruce Lee's legacy of all. A man who never wanted to be boxed into a single style ended up leaving behind a story nobody has ever managed to box into a single version of the truth either.